everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show, stories about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа Ushanka Show. Recently I stumbled upon an interesting book in my local library, and I know some of you might be laughing, but yes, I do still visit libraries, and I love libraries, and I love paper books. What caught my attention was the title, Russian Journal, so I grabbed the book, checked it out, and then I started learning a lot of interesting things about this book. And I guess here I need to admit my ignorance, I think that's the word, because the name of the author, John Steinbeck, didn't tell me anything, and only when I opened the second page and I read the list of also by John Steinbeck, I was like, holy crap! That's the guy who wrote The Grapes of Wrath. So I read the book with great interest, and we will talk about it a little bit later. Then I started digging, and guess what I found? There are several unclassified Soviet Security Services documents that relates to John Steinbeck's visit to the Soviet Union in 1947, and as a result of that visit, he wrote the book Russian Journal. I translated those documents into English, and we're going to discuss them a little bit later as well. I'm not sure if you're aware, but apparently John Steinbeck was a big deal in the Soviet Union, mostly because of his book The Grapes of Wrath, which was published in the Soviet Union in 1941, 800,000 copies, and later the movie also made into the Soviet Union. And here's a fun fact, while his book was published over and over again, I discovered another issues of this book from 1957, 1977, and again in 1986. Movie was shown for a short period of time in 1948, and then it was not shown again ever. And the rumor is that the movie was removed because Soviet people were impressed that even a poor, broke American farmer can afford to buy a pickup truck when Soviet farmers during the collectivization were not allowed to own even a horse. So it appears that the only reason why John Steinbeck was allowed to come to the Soviet Union in 1947 is because Stalin considered him one of the greatest American writers of that time. And while I was trying to get more information about John Steinbeck's Russian Journal, I discovered that his original manuscript was recently as October of 2023, was sold for $32,000, and that's his day book that recorded the 1947 journey through Russia, Ukraine, and Georgia with Robert Capa, the complete record of the trip that would become a Russian journal. Man, I wish I had enough money to buy that. So what can I say after reading 1947 Russian journal? I had mixed feelings. On one hand, I was surprised, and on the other hand, I was a little bit disappointed. I was surprised because of the way John wrote his book. It was kind of like this sarcastic, ironic way, like it's a serious big deal going to Soviet Union in 1947, and he was just like joking around all the time. And this ironic, or I could say smart-ass style reminded me about a different book written by two Soviet writers, Ilf and Petrov, who back in 1935 traveled across the United States exploring America, and they wrote a book which was translated into English as American Road Trip. I strongly recommend that book. It has a lot of photos from 1935, so that's a lot of similarities there between American Road Trip by Ilf and Petrov and Russian Journal by John Steinbeck. And my disappointment with the book was because it didn't reflect the actual situation in the Soviet Union in those years, because Soviet Union was hit again with another famine in 1946 and 47. No one, of course, knows the real numbers, how many people starved to death, but it's up to 1.5 million. And meanwhile, if you read his book, he was fed so good anywhere he went in Ukraine or Georgia. Tables were packed with food, plenty of drinks, so there was like always a big party anywhere Americans went. Meanwhile, people were starving. But of course, to be fair, I can't blame John for that, because he saw what he was allowed to see, and I think he was smart enough to understand that everything he saw was Potemkin village presentation. He only was allowed to go to specific areas which were prepared for him to show Stalin's village. And maybe that explains the way he wrote the book. It's so like ironic and sarcastic because he knew that he was not allowed to see the real life. So as I mentioned earlier, John, together with his friend photographer Robert Capa, went to the Soviet Union in 1947, and the book was published in 1948. And for what I see, this book didn't do that well. I guess it wasn't just critical enough of the Soviet Union or positive enough of the Soviet Union. So appears it was a flop in America. Let me know if you know anything different about it. And then it was not published at all in the Soviet Union. This book appeared in the USSR, translated into Russian only during the Perestroika time, in the last years of the USSR. Stalin wasn't impressed either with John Steinbeck book. But just like wine, some books can get better with years, and I truly enjoyed reading it in 2025 because, first of all, it's American perspective on the Soviet Union, and he was noticing a lot of details that I found extremely interesting and curious. So yeah, I enjoyed the book immensely, although I said generally was somewhat a disappointment. I expected something bigger from such a big name as John Steinbeck, the author of The Grapes of Wrath. And I also wonder what happened to the 3,000 pictures that his friend Robert Capa took. So he brought his own buddy, photographer, and they managed to get the most pictures back to the United States. But I was digging around and I couldn't locate the archive where all those pictures are stored. By the way, if you're interested in getting this book, it's available pretty cheap on eBay. More recent editions you can find under $10 on eBay. The original 1948 goes for about $40, and the one with the John Steinbeck signature, they asking $2,000. And before we get to the declassified state security documents from the John Steinbeck visit, just a quick overview of the whole story. So John decided to visit Soviet Union and write about people, not politics, not the government. And he was kind of skeptical if he's going to get visa. He got Soviet visa. He had to work harder to get visa for his buddy, Robert Capa, who is a photographer, because Soviet said, "You don't need a photographer. We got plenty of photographers." He traveled to Moscow, and from there, his trips were strictly controlled. So he flew to Ukraine, to Kyiv, capital of Ukraine, and visited 2 different collective farms. Then he had to return to Moscow. Then he flew to Stalingrad, visited the Stalingrad tractor factory, flew back to Moscow. Then he flew to Georgia, visited Georgia for a little bit, and flew back to Moscow again. And then they returned home. And now let's take a look at that secret report from Ukraine about the visit of American writer Steinbeck. Top secret, copy number 7, to the chief of the second main directorate of the USSR MGB. So MGB, that was a new name. Before it was NKVD, then became Ministry of the State Security, or MGB, then it became KGB. To Major General Comrade Pitovranov. And if you're curious, this is General Pitovranov. Special report on the stay in Ukraine of the American writer Steinbeck. The famous American writer Steinbeck and the New York Herald Tribune correspondent Capa arrived in Kyiv on August 6. From August 6 to 15, Steinbeck and Capa stayed in Kyiv, getting acquainted with the city, its sites, and its areas of destruction. When they're talking about destruction, Kyiv was still in ruins after the World War II. They visited the Ukrainian Art Museum, the Lavra and Sofia Reserve, the Partisan exhibition, the bazaar, and the bakery. For 3 days, they stayed in the collective farms of the Kyiv region named after Shevchenko, that's the famous Ukrainian poet, in the villages of Lyutesh in Dimir district and Muzychi, Kyiv Svetoshinsky district. Steinbeck also met with Ukrainian writers. There's a list of different names, like 5 different Ukrainian writers, at a private dinner hosted by Kornichukov at his apartment. In addition, Steinbeck and Capa attended 2 performances in Kharkiv Ukrainian Theater and a newsreel screening at the Kyiv Newsreel Studio. During their stay in Kyiv, Steinbeck and Capa were provided with a daily agent and external surveillance, so they were being watched day and night. Regarding Steinbeck and Capa, the following data was obtained. Check this out, that's amazing. Steinbeck John Ernest, born in 1902 in Salinas, California, USA, is a married citizen of the USA. Capa Robert, born in 1913 in Hungary, is an unmarried US citizen. According to his words, he was born in Transcarpathia and often visited Uzhgorod, where his uncle, a member of the Communist Party, allegedly lives now. His father was a Hungarian gendarme. Kappa was in the International Brigade in Spain and was a friend of the Hungarian writer Matthias Rákosi, who died in Spain, and General Lukács. During World War II, Kappa participated in combat operations on the Western Front. According to Steinbeck, he and Kappa are longtime friends. By nature, Steinbeck is silent, does not talk much, does not ask questions himself, answers questions reluctantly and dryly, and tries to look more closely without expressing his opinions. On the contrary, his companion Kappa is distinguished by his talkativeness. He talks a lot, is interested in everything, and tries to get into everything. He gives the impression of a person who uses his mission in Ukraine to collect data that can only interest an experienced intelligence officer. Analysis of available materials suggests that Steinbeck's visit to the USSR is connected with specific political intentions of the US government. This is evidenced by the fact that after arriving in the USSR, according to available data, Steinbeck met with the US ambassador. The subject of their conversation was to discuss the goals of Steinbeck's stay in the Soviet Union. The US government aspired to use Steinbeck's position as the writer and his political authority in the Soviet Union to conduct pro-American propaganda through him. They aimed to show that the US government pursues a democratic policy in general, that reactionary circles in the USA are not a significant force, and that the US's individual military and propaganda efforts are the results of a response to the Soviet government's policy and, therefore, have a forced nature. At the same time, while in Soviet Union, Steinbeck should study the political mood of the people and, apparently, the country's agricultural potential. Thus, characterizing the foreign policy of the Soviet Union, Steinbeck told the agent Alexandrova, an employee of Ukrainian United Credit Union. So you need to pause. So he is talking to KGB agents pretty much. So they send people who work for Ukrainian United Credit Union, but in the same time, the same person is a MGB agent, and it's a female. The tendency of American propaganda toward the USSR is a response to the new tone of the Soviet Union toward the USA. Gromyko is a very rude and harsh person. I witnessed how the audience in the hall where Gromyko spoke was outraged by his tone and attacks. And Gromyko, I don't know what position he had back in 1947, but later he was a Minister of Foreign Affairs at my time in 1980s. But the point is not in Gromyko. This is the new tone of the Soviet foreign policy toward the USA. Molotov's tone at the Paris conference was harsher than ever, leaving a heavy impression on the USA. At the same time, Steinbeck praised his acquaintances Maisky and Umansky, who, according to him, are the type of diplomats respected in the USA. While praising the Soviet people, Steinbeck emphasized the inconsistency of the government's policy with the people's aspirations. According to Steinbeck, the people are peaceful, but the Soviet government is aggressive. The people are friendly towards American people. The Soviet government is hostile. At the same time, Steinbeck claimed that the US government's domestic and foreign policies aim to promote the prosperity of the American and world populations. Steinbeck and Kappa always emphasized the complete prosperity of the USA. Farmers' incomes are 10 times higher than before the war, and the state and the unemployed and veterans support farmers. There is no unemployment in the USA, but it is expected soon. For now, there are not only no unemployed, but, on the contrary, a significant labor shortage due to the large scale of new construction. Average wages for work in the USA are high. Characterizing the internal and external policy of the USA, Steinbeck said, "The conviction of Americans is that if they do not help Europe, then Europe will perish economically, which means that America will perish too. In opinion of Americans, The defense of Europe is the defense of America itself. President Truman will be re-elected in the upcoming presidential elections. Wallace has enormous influence, but he cannot lead America. Therefore, he will have a decisive impact on the candidacy of the Congress and, through Congress, force Truman to change his policy. However, all candidates for president and Congress will attack the USSR. Stassin is an entirely unrealistic figure and his influence is very insignificant. I have no idea what people he's talking about, Wallace or Stassin, so if you know, please comment. During a dinner at Kornichikovsky, writer Wanda Vasilevska proposed a toast to the people, emphasizing the people and the governments are the one. Steinbeck accepted the toast, adding that he drinks to the people. Steinbeck tried to present the rampant reaction which determines the internal and external policy of the USA only as an utterly explainable policy of the reactionary opposition in the conditions of bourgeois democracy. It was not a decisive force in terms of its influence or forms of struggle with progressive circles. A small handful of reactionaries are aggressive towards the Soviet Union, he said. In Steinbeck's comments, the tendency to compromise progressive political figures, particularly those who oppose the USA's imperialist aspirations, dominate. Speaking of Elliot Roosevelt, as Steinbeck stated, Elliot Roosevelt is a fool who wrote a stupid book. Elliot is not at all like his father, okay, so that's father of the President Roosevelt, and does not enjoy any authority in the USA. According to Steinbeck, the English writer Presley, who is friendly towards the USSR, is weak. Therefore, your friends have insignificant authority abroad, meaning the USSR exaggerates their significance. With even more significant irritation, Steinbeck, in complete agreement with Kappa, spoke out against the Communist Party of the USA and its policy, stating the following: "The Communist Party of the USA is a sect that pursues a stupid policy." As previously stated, Steinbeck apparently intends to use his stay in the USSR to establish the Soviet Union's agricultural potential. This is confirmed by the fact that Steinbeck is the fourth American competent in agricultural matters who visited the USSR at the same time in 1945, 46, and 47 and shown keen interest in crop issues. In 1945, Dr. Michel, the agriculture attaché of the U.S. Embassy in the USSR, came. In 1946, agricultural specialists Strawn and Bollig, and now Steinbeck. So I guess the United States was trying to figure out why people are starving in the Soviet Union. While in the collective farm, Steinbeck and Kappa emphasized that they were primarily interested in the life and daily life of rural workers, but in fact, Steinbeck mainly collected information about the collective farm harvest, level of mechanization, what crops are sown, and so forth. It is also characteristic that in the first collective farm, Steinbeck was almost uninterested in anything, contenting himself with the laconic explanations of the collective farm chairman. Upon returning, he said in a conversation with Kappa, so they were listening to their conversation, that's hilarious, that the collective farm has 2 tractors, 2 threshers, 2 dynamos, and 365,000 pounds of wheat. However, these figures were not mentioned in the chairman's explanations or the collective farmer's answers. The fact that agricultural issues are of primary interest to Steinbeck is also evidenced by the fact that discussing with Kappa the plans for a trip around the USSR, Steinbeck said the following: "We must definitely visit Stalingrad and the Don Steppes, not the Donbass, but the Don region." Unlike Steinbeck, Kappa's behavior was marked by significant activity and intrusive, obviously hypocritical emphasis on his sympathy for the Soviet Union. From the numerous photographs taken by Kappa, and it looked like they were all directly taken in the anti-Soviet spirit, he photographed a rather emaciated visitor, so he didn't look good, in the Ukrainian art museum. And on his way to the collective farm, a poorly dressed collective farm family, all members of which, including teenagers, were pumping water with the pump. It was established that Kappa knows Russian language, but he hides it. Using an interpreter, Kappa often answered questions before they were translated and reacted to what was said before translation. During his stay in Kiev, Kappa received several documents, some of which were suspicious in content. And there's the beauty right here. Copies of these documents are attached. Suspicious connections between Steinbeck and Kappa in Ukraine were not identified. So they were watching if they're talking to any people out of the circle that they established. And it's signed by Minister of State Security of Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Lieutenant General Savchenko, August 3, 1947. A single copy. Pretty amazing, isn't it? This is your Stalin-era Soviet Union. 2 American visitors talking to state security agents pretending to be someone else, being watched by the state security agent day and night. They have their room being listened to and recorded. They copy all the documents that go through the hands of these 2 guys. So that's pretty impressive. And now let's take a look at the second document. And this one was written by the car driver that drove John Steinbeck and Robert Kappa in Kiev and the surrounding area. It looks like he drove a car called ZIS 101, so Zavod imени Stalina, so it's a factory name after Stalin, and it seems like he was specifically a driver for foreigners. Statement: I have been working as a garage foreman since May 1947, and during this work period, I have dealt with foreign representatives visiting Kiev. I met and I worked as a driver in ZIS 101 car with a Scotsman, wife and husband, so there was other tourists from Scotland, as well as Mr. Steinbeck and correspondent Kappa, and more recently there's another person, Mr. Lilichuk. Due to the nature of my work, I witnessed the American Kappa freely roaming Kiev and collective farms and photographing inappropriate objects. That's really interesting. He visited Oskold's grave several times, so that's one of the popular places in Kiev, the grave of Oskold. Photographed bridges, and while riding the scooter motorboat, photographed both banks of the river and the territory of Lane Kuznia, so which is the factory. Kappa photographed poorly dressed children on the Shevchenko collective farm in the village of Lutezh and a collective farm family eating from one bowl. Steinbeck was keenly interested in the details of the harvest in the collective farm in the most detailed way and did not write anything down. Still seizing a moment, under pretext of natural needs, he took out a notebook and pencil and wrote something down. I was with them all the time. Kappa always carried his camera with him. Well, really, he was a photographer. But there was a time when he left it in the car for a short time, so I took it and I tried to aim the lens and the object, found that objects located nearby were blurred with the corresponding rotation of diagrams. So dude was playing with the camera, trying to figure out how it works. Objects located at a distance were visible for photography. I witnessed this when Steinbeck and Kappa pretended not to know Russian, but in fact, they reacted to Russian speech. Even once I knocked on their door and entered, I noticed they spoke fluent Russian. They were writing in notebooks, and when I entered, they quickly hid that. While being in a movie theater, an unknown woman approached them and spoke to them in English for a long time. I reported this to Comrade Poltoratsky, who told me that she was a movie actress. Later that evening, around noon, this woman arrived in a car at the Intourist Hotel and took the elevator to the 3rd floor where Steinbeck and Kappa were staying. I also reported this to Comrade Poltoratsky, who told me she also lived in the Intourist Hotel. I'm writing this statement in a connection with the fact that before the arrival of foreign representatives, Comrade Poltoratsky warned me that those were serious people. It's kind of poor translation here, sorry, it's a Google Translate. And when they met with Poltoratsky, Peregud, and Usimbrovsky, they behaved familiarly, often excessively consuming alcohol, as was the case in the village of Lutezh, when Usimirovsky and Poltoratsky were heavily intoxicated and watched over the foreign representatives. And now he's switching to a different situation. When the French delegation arrived, the Frenchman's wife was shocked by Peregoud, who, also drunk, behaved unnaturally and drove late at night to the Galaseevsky forest with the writers Rilsky Malishka. So they all sounds like they all were local Ukrainian writers or poets, where they recited their works until morning. In particular, Malishka recited a poem called Sirko. The content was that during the Great Patriotic War, a horse worked in artillery, forgotten, unfed, and often worked more than the Red Army soldiers, and no one paid attention to it. They had an argument with Rilsky about this. Rilsky suggested calling the poem Gnida, Laos. I didn't hear anything more. They generally behaved indecently, so there's two drunk poets arguing about the poem. In my opinion, such behavior of our representatives toward foreigners is harmful because, in a drunken state, they say too much and give foreigners free access to what they are not supposed to know. And it makes me wonder if John Steinbeck was aware that every his step was watched and recorded. When I started researching him, it looks like he worked for CIA. At that time, it wasn't called CIA, but during World War II, he was a part of the strategic services. So he probably had some basic training. I don't know, but it's very interesting to find out if he actually wrote something about his visit to the Soviet Union besides the book, Russian Journal. And I'm planning to make a detailed review of his book, Russian Journal. Unfortunately, I had to return it to the library, but I'm planning to get it back. I already have a list of a lot of interesting moments that I wanted to cover. And if you guys have any questions, please post here in the comment section. Otherwise, we'll talk to you soon. До побачення. Goodbye.